Today we're going to talk about solving two-step equations. So this is what goes in your table of contents. I can solve two-step equations with one variable. Remember, a variable is that letter that represents the unknown number. We don't know what this number is. That's what we're trying to find out. You have previously learned how to solve one-step equations. Now you will be solving two-step equations. The whole goal is the same: solve for the variable. Let's look at how we can solve two-step equations by an example. So here's our example: negative 4x plus 2 equals 10. Last time we learned that when a number is touching a variable, it means that they are multiplying. So this is the same as saying negative 4 times x right here. On that last lesson, we also talked about how to find the inverse operation. So when we did that, we were doing the opposite. So if it was adding, we were subtracting. If it was subtracting, we were adding. If it was multiplying, we then divided. If it was dividing, we multiplied. So we were doing the inverse operations to answer one-step equations. All we had to do was one thing to get x's answer. One thing. So that's why it was a one-step equation. Now we are working on two-step equations. There are two things we're going to have to do to get x by itself on this side of the equal sign. So let's talk about how we do that. Step 1, isolate the variable by either adding or subtracting the constant. A constant is a number without a variable, so this positive 2 here, on both sides of the equation. So let's go ahead and do what we learned the other day. So negative 4x plus 2 equals 10. I'm going to put that. Now, so we're going to add or subtract. Well, I can't add or subtract here because this is multiplying, and I know that the inverse of multiplying is dividing. So no, can't do that. Plus 2. Oh, that would be adding or subtracting because the opposite, the inverse operation of plus 2 is minus 2. And remember, whatever you do to one side of this equal sign, you must do to the other. So I'm going to subtract 2 from that side as well. So 2 minus 2 is 0. So those are gone. All that's left on this side is negative 4 times x equals, what's 10 minus 2? It's 8. Okay, so first step is to add or subtract. Now we're going to move on to the second step. The second step is saying eliminate the coefficient. Coefficient means this number that is attached to the variable. Coefficient. Coefficient means they need each other, okay? So eliminate the coefficient of the variable by either multiplying or dividing the coefficient on both sides of the equation. So let's go ahead and put what we have right now. So after step 1, we ended up with negative 4x equals 8. So we are going to multiply or divide to get x by itself. Well, what's keeping x from being by itself? Negative 4. So the way to do that, it's negative 4 times x. So I'm going to divide by a negative 4. Remember, I don't want to put divided by negative 4x because that would move the x to the other side. All I want to move is this coefficient that is holding on to my x that I can't get by itself. Negative 4 divided by negative 4, well, 2 negatives makes a positive. 4 divided by 4 is 1. So all that's left on that side is x. And if I divide by negative 4 on this side, 8 divided by negative 4. Well, a positive divided by a negative is a negative. 8 divided by 4 is 2. So x equals negative 2. So let's plug negative 2 in here. Negative 4 times negative 2 is a positive 8 plus 2 equals 10. So yes, it works. So let's go ahead and try an example. So here we have, it says now we can use the same steps anytime we have a coefficient that is a fraction. So we're going to use the fraction this time. Okay, so let's see. The first thing that we are going to do, step 1, add or subtract. Let me put multiplier divide symbols up here so that we remember. Easier to see. Add and subtract first, multiplier divide second. So we've got negative 2/3 x, that means negative 2/3 times x minus 2 equals 4. So the first thing we're going to do is add or subtract. Well, I can't add or subtract the coefficient because it's touching the variable, which tells me they're multiplying. That's not adding or subtracting as an inverse operation. Minus 2, I could do the inverse operation of addition. So that's my first step. So plus 2 and plus 2, because whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other side of the equal sign. A negative 2 plus 2, we know that when we add opposites, a negative and a positive 2, we end up with 0. So those are gone. All that's left on this side is negative 2/3 x equals 6. Okay, so step 1 is done. Now we're going to do step 2. We got to find where we can multiply or divide and get that variable by itself. So here we are. This is what we have now. What is keeping that x from being by itself? Well, negative 2/3 is keeping x from being by itself. Because this is a fraction, what we're going to do, remember fractions are like dividing, so we are going to multiply the inverse, or the reciprocal. Reciprocal, let's write that. Reciprocal. Reciprocal is another way of saying, we'll put an equal sign, opposite or flipped. Okay, so we're going to flip it. So instead of doing a negative 2/3, we're going to do a negative 3/2, and we're going to multiply it. Remember, parentheses touching means multiplying. Why am I putting a negative? Well, I'm putting a negative because x has to be positive. It can't be a negative x, it has to be a positive x. And the only way to get x positive is if I do a negative times a negative, because remember, those two cancel out because it's an even number of negatives. 3/2 times 2/3. 3 times 2 is 6. 2 times 3 is 6. So this is 6/6. Well, we know 6/6 equals 1. So those are gone and x is by itself. Now remember, whatever I do to one side, I must do to the other. So I am going to multiply a negative 3/2 to this side. Well, remember 6, always, whole numbers have like that invisible 1 underneath them. You can make it into a fraction to work with this. When we multiply fractions, 6 times 3 is 18. And 1 times 2 is 2, and it's a positive times a negative, so it needs to be negative. Now 18 divided by 2 is 9, so our answer is negative 9. So x equals negative 9. Let's plug it in and make sure it works. If I was to do this, negative 2/3 times a negative 9 instead of x, and remember all whole numbers have that invisible 1 because I'm working with fractions, minus 2. Let's see if we get 4. Well, 2 times 9 is 18. 3 times 1 is 3. It's a negative times a negative, so it's turned positive, and it's minus 2. Well, 3 goes into 18 how many times? 6 times. So really, I could make this 6 minus 2, and it equals 4. So yes, we did it right. Okay, so now you've got some practice to do. Let's make sure there are no surprises on this practice before you get started. So you should be okay with 1, you should be okay with 2. Don't forget, 3 is a fraction. We do the reciprocal. So remember, we're flipping it. So instead, it would be multiplying 4 over 1, because if the 4 is on the bottom, we're going to put the 4 on the top, and remember, it has to be negative because this is a negative. 2 negatives make a positive to help x get by itself, okay? But remember, that's step 2. Don't do that step 1. Step 1 is adding and subtracting. So you're going to get rid of that one first, and then you're going to do the reciprocal. All right, good luck.